Good evening. Welcome to the PoliticIt podcast. We have Ryan Cowley tonight, and Ryan is the director of elections, right, for the state of Utah.
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah, I got to know Ryan when he was at Weber County, and I guess you moved up, right?
Yeah, we gave you a little tour there, and
Yeah.
since that time I've gone to work for the state.
So tell me what's going on. I mean, last night I just watched this 2,000 Mules, and I know there's a lot of people worried about elections, and I know the way you guys handled it in Weber County. We did a whole podcast on that, right? But what kinds of things do you do to kind of secure our elections in Utah?
Yeah, so a lot of people kind of just think of elections as being the time, when they get the ballot in the mail, they're ready to vote. But election preparation goes on throughout the entire year. And we've really had a big focus on security. We're actually a very mature vote-by-mail state, which gives us advantage because we have mature laws to do that. A few of the things that we're doing right now are really focusing in on creating an election guidebook for election officials around the state. So obviously we'll have the code that drives everything that we do in elections. But then also just kind of taking some of the best practices from around the state. Those can come from Weber County or Davis County or Daggett County, wherever we find that somebody's doing something really well. And we just want to kind of make a guidebook that everybody in the state can follow to kind of get some of those best practices and make sure that we're covering all of our bases.
So what kinds of things did you do in Weber County to secure this vote-by-mail election? Where are the vulnerabilities, and what did you do to mitigate those?
Yeah, so we've kind of broke down election security into 4 pillars. We have voter registration, which is really important. That's the framework for everything we do. When we first started doing vote by mail, that was one of the areas that we realized we needed to focus in very heavily. If we don't have good rolls, then we're not going to have good outcomes in the elections. And it's really important as we take a step back in elections, it's important that we understand that voting is a constitutional right. So everybody who is 18 years old and a United States citizen has a right to vote. Now, what we need to do as election officials is make sure that they only get to vote one time and also ensure that their vote is counted properly. So it really starts with that voter registration. A lot of times we hear about universal vote by mail. There's some states that just chose to send out ballots to every registered voter. In Utah, we don't do that. We only mail them out to active registered voters. So within that registration database, we're actively taking out voters who have passed away. So there's a state law that requires those to be removed within 5 days. We actually receive reports from Vital Statistics. We work addresses through the National Change of Address. So when somebody moves from their house to another house and they go to the post office and they say, hey, I'm moving from, for example, from Ogden to Roy, we get that information. We'll make them inactive so they're not going to get a ballot in the mail, and then we'll send them a postcard saying, hey, we think you've moved. What's your new address? We'll do those kind of things throughout the year, and those are huge benefits because then we're not just mailing a ballot to anybody, we're mailing it to people that we know live there. We also do automatic registration through the driver's license. So when somebody gets a driver's license for the first time or renews their driver's license, then we're going to get that information back into a clerk's office and update it so that we can keep track of people. On average, there's about 20% of the population that moves every year. So it's really important if we're going to do vote by mail that we're getting those ballots to the actual people that reside there.
Yeah, so I know that's something that really gets people charged up when you say you vote by mail, right? And the idea that the ballots just get sent out to everyone. So I guess what you're doing all during the year then is you're kind of maintaining that voter registration system so that you only have active voters on there.
Exactly, yeah, and it takes a lot of work. So if you're going to do this very well, it takes a lot of effort to keep those voter rolls clean.
Yeah, and I guess when we first switched to vote by mail, did you notice a lot of problems with your voter database?
Yeah, so Pew Charitable Trust did a study, I think it was about 2012, and across the country they found that about 20% of the voter rolls were deadwood. So it was voters who'd moved, things like that. When we voted in person, that wasn't as big of a deal because people would come in, they would show their ID at the time that they voted. And so those first few times that we did vote by mail before we got the list maintenance down, we had a lot of undeliverable ballots, and it took a little while to clean that up. Now, for example, in Weber County, where I worked prior to going to the Lieutenant Governor's office, we were down to about 1.5% of our ballots were undeliverable. A standard mailing would be around 10%.
So you really did get that voter registration system in line with where people were at then.
We did, yeah.
So I noticed I just moved to a new house, and the other day we checked the mailbox on the new house, and there was a card in the mail that said our address had changed at the voter, at Weber County. So how would they have known that?
So with that, they would have got that from the National Change of Address list, and that's part of it.
Because we had our mail forwarded, that's what tipped you off.
Correct, yes. And one other component to that is ballots cannot by law be forwarded, which is a really important security feature. We've seen things around the country where they show a stack of ballots at an apartment complex, something like that. In Utah, those ballots are going to get returned to the elections office. They wouldn't even go to your new house, so that would have come back to us. But that national change of address and working with the post office is a really vital part of security and vote by mail.
That's interesting. So what kinds of things have you done with the state already?
So one of the things that we did is in Representative Hawkins' HB 313, one of the vulnerabilities is staying on the topic of the voter registration is we've created now a voter registration audit. In our analysis prior to even a lot of the national conversation about the 2020 election, we realized that was an area where I think we do a good job of registration, but there's nothing to verify that. So if there are issues in different counties where maybe there's an issue with how they're assigning people to a political party or how they're plotting those people on a map, which ultimately means the type of ballot that they get. So when we have House districts or Senate districts, we want to make sure that they're getting the right ballot style. So one of the things that we've done is we'll do a sampling every year and go through those voter registrations and pull up some from every county and just make sure, hey, is this person eligible to vote? Do they have the right paperwork to accompany that registration? Is their house in the correct precinct? Do they have a signature on file? Those kind of things. Are they deceased? If somebody's deceased, we want to make sure that counties are cleaning that up. And so this audit will give us good insight into how those lists are being maintained throughout the state. And that will be something that we report to the legislature biannually, and then we'll also report back to the clerks on our findings. So if we do start to find some issues, and that'll help us, get even better at what we do.
It's interesting with Representative Hawkins' bill. I know I was on the committee that heard it in the Senate, right, the Government Operations Committee. And when it went into our committee, the committee actually voted to take out the surveillance cameras at the polling places, right, the drop boxes basically. But we actually got that back in, right, on the floor of the Senate. We actually amended the bill and put that back in there. And, after watching that movie the other night, I thought, well, golly, it's kind of nice to have that. At least that's something that will calm people down a little bit, right? So,
the important thing with that bill is we also got the funding for it, and that was a key component, because if we're going to do something like that, it's expensive to put cameras in. And so we did get a $500,000 appropriation, which is something that's been lacking a little bit, I think, from just a general policy standpoint and the legislature, as we install all of these new laws and change things, is adequately funding it is a really, really important feature.
So the audit piece in there is mainly just the audit of the voter rolls?
Yeah, as far as that component, there's a lot of other audits that go on in elections besides just the voter rolls, but specifically that's something that we did this year to make sure that we're doing that correctly.
Very good. Yeah. So what other things do you think we need to do across the state?
Yeah, so I think standardization, I've talked about that election guidebook that we want to create. There's a lot of really good practices. And when you get into really close races, especially across county lines, historically we've seen with, for example, the congressional races between Mia Love and Ben McAdams and Matheson, those have been really, really close races. And so, something if Salt Lake's doing something slightly different than Utah County, and those races, come down to a small number of votes, that could make a really big difference in a race like that. And so we just want to standardize some of those processes and procedures.
So now, being the election official for the state, do you have some type of authority to do that, or? Is it this law that we just passed that gives you that authority, or what authority do you really have over the elections across the whole state?
Yeah, so the lieutenant governor is the chief elections officer for the state, and state law gives her general supervisory authority over elections. She also has the ability to settle election disputes. Some of those obviously will go to court, but so she can interpret the code, provide guidance, and then generally be an overseer. Within that, so we saw a series of laws this year that also gave rulemaking authority to the director of elections for the state. So there's certain areas, for example, chain of custody. So with the movie that you referenced, there's obviously kind of a chain of custody that has to occur with the ballots. That's not an area that's well defined in code. There's a lot of really good practices that the county clerks follow, but that rulemaking authority is something now that we have within our office. And so I'm working on creating rules that will specify, there have to be 2 people, which is also state law, but then also creating a log of that, making sure that there's always, one of the things that we do in Weber County really well is there aren't pens or things like that allowed where there's live ballots. So if they're pulling those ballots out of the envelope, somebody couldn't be filling in the ovals, those kind of things, and just creating a really good chain of custody, making sure that everything is always done with 2 people and that there's a record of that happening.
Yeah, so that really helps a lot, doesn't it? Just that piece. And I guess and I hate to come to this movie, but I know a lot of people have watched it. That's why I decided to watch it before you come on, just to kind of see what their complaints were. So as far as drop boxes, we now have video surveillance, right? So we know that's occurring. What other things have we done? Chain of custody is one you mentioned, which is an important one, right? How do those ballots actually get from that box back to where they're going to be counted? So what other things can you think of that might be important?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of things that can go into addressing ballot security. One of the things that we do is we identify all of the voters up front. So when people say, the only secure way to vote is in person with ID, that's a great method. Utah has done that for years. So if you vote in person, but every voter that registers to vote has to provide either a valid driver's license or a valid social security number. And we actually have a real-time connection between our voter registration database and those. So we can identify that, yes, that is a real living person. It will help us identify if they're not a citizen and some of those issues. And then the security in the envelope. So every one of those envelopes has a bunch of security features that I'm not going to go into on this podcast, but there's a lot of features there. The ballot itself is very difficult to replicate to the specifications in order to have, like a bunch of duplicate ballots. So somebody would have to forge the envelope, forge a bunch of ballots to be able to go dump those into a ballot box. And then on top of that, they've also got to match the signatures of those voters. And every ballot has a unique identifier with it that comes out of the voter registration database, and that identifier isn't available on any of the public records requests. So there's a lot of security within that would make it so that somebody couldn't just go get 30 or 40 or 50 or thousands of ballots.
So if every ballot had the same number on it, then there'd be a problem, wouldn't there?
And you've got to forge the envelope, you've got to duplicate the ballot and all of those numbers at the same time. And
so that has to match what's on the envelope, and then people sign that envelope, right?
Correct.
And so that envelope isn't even separated from the ballot until the signature's been verified,
yes,
right?
Exactly. Yep. The signature's verified first, and then that's taken away from.
So how does that process work?
The signature verification?
Yeah.
So it's going to be quite a bit different in the smaller counties versus the larger counties. So Utah, Salt Lake, Weber, Davis, Washington County, Cache County, they have some machines that will actually take a digital image of every envelope as it comes through. It'll read the barcode off of there and say, is this a ballot from this valid election? Some people are mailed 2 ballots. So if they've moved, if they said, hey, I made a mistake on my ballot, we mail them a new one. And that, a lot of times people are like, oh, I got 2 ballots. Could I vote those? No, you can't, because only one of those can be active at any given time. So those machines will take and kick out the first ballot that was what we called spoiled. The second one would take the digital image. Some of the counties use an automatic verification process where the first pass, the machine has an algorithm that'll look at. That's audited to make sure that it's working properly. And then any of the signatures that remain, those are looked at by human eyes. And most of the counties do training with forensic documents examiners, people like that actually teach them some of the skills to help.
So in a smaller county, they actually look at every one of the signatures.
They do look at every one. It's a long, laborious process, but they do look at every single envelope and compare that with up to 5 signatures that we have in the voter registration database.
And so if those don't match, what happens?
So if those don't match, then usually a second or a third person will look at it, do an in-depth analysis, make sure that doesn't match. And if it still doesn't match, then they'll send a letter to the voter telling them that, hey, your ballot has basically been challenged. A lot of times it's because the voter didn't sign the envelope, or maybe you signed your wife's or something like that. So they'll get the letter. They have the opportunity to cure that. To cure it also requires a driver's license or a social security number and then a matching signature. And then at that point, that ballot could be counted.
Interesting. We're talking to Ryan Cowley, head of elections for the state of Utah, and we'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Ricky Hatch. I'm your Weber County Clerk Auditor. I'm running for re-election and have a primary this year. I don't want you to just trust me. I want to talk to you just briefly about things that I've done. Election security has been hot for the past couple of years. I want you to know that I, as a CPA, looked at the election through an accounting and audit and control standpoint. I identified risks and safeguards and then gaps and brought those to the state legislature and the lieutenant governor's office, and we created legislation to further strengthen our election security and integrity here in Utah. But elections are only about half my job. The other half is auditing, and as a CPA, I helped establish an internal audit function and program at the county to help make sure that your money is being spent wisely and isn't wasted or involved in fraudulent stuff. Mostly, I want to listen to you. I don't have all the answers. I'm still learning, and I would appreciate your vote. Thank you so much.
We're back here with Ryan Cowley from the State Elections Office. You're the Director of Elections. And so, let's talk about some other issues. I know the Lieutenant Governor seems to be pretty dedicated to making sure we do things to secure the vote, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been amazing to watch. So I've been doing elections basically since 2005. I started as a rover and the IT person that helped program machines in Summit County, to being the chief deputy clerk, to coming to Weber County as the elections director, and then up to the lieutenant governor's office. So I've kind of seen the process, all the way from the polling place on up to kind of the administration. And having a lieutenant governor that cares so deeply is really an important thing, especially in this time where there's kind of a little bit of a confidence crisis in our elections, and that leadership's huge. And she's willing to step out there and tackle the issues.
What kinds of things has she done that you've noticed that are really helping?
So one of the things that she's done that's really neat is she's gone out to, she has the goal of being in every county clerk's office. So she's been out and she's been to 24 of the 29 counties so far, and she just took office last year. And in those visits, she'll visit with the clerk, go through and tour their facilities, see what they've got, what equipment they've got, and address concerns. And that's really important when you have a very important decision maker, the supervisor of elections, that actually sees how things are on the ground.
Well, and then she hired you, right? I mean, that was a good move, I think. I remember we did a podcast where we walked through Weber County with Ricky Hatch, and you were there, and we kind of outlined every single step that happened. So if people are, curious about that, they could go back and watch that one. But so tell me a little bit more. I noticed she was also involved with these new legislative actions too.
Yeah, she was very involved in that. She attended almost all of the committee hearings, which was fantastic. But she just has a lot of good insight. And really, even as a state senator, a lot of the bills that she passed were really to protect people's right to vote. And it's great when we talk about voting. Like I said earlier, it's a constitutional right to vote. And so we have to make sure that people have access. And she's really a champion of the access. But also on the security front, she's involved in different meetings with different groups, the National Association of Secretaries of State, things like that, where these topics of security nationally are being discussed, and she's very much in the know on those things.
Very good. So now let's go back to this document that you're putting together. Are you really trying to standardize across all the counties the way the elections are conducted, or you just standardize the security procedures? What exactly do you have in that handbook?
Yeah, so it would be things like, for example, a logic and accuracy test, which for those who don't know what a logic and accuracy test, it's also called an LNA. So if you watch different podcasts or see things and they call it an LNA, it's a logic and accuracy test, and that's a pre-election test. That's the piece that I've been working on within the last couple of weeks. And basically what that is to test that all of the equipment is calibrated correctly, that the ballot's programmed correctly. So in a city election, if it's a vote for two, making sure that both of those votes for whoever they voted for is accurate. And so what we want to do is we don't want to dictate to the counties how they do things. When you take a Daggett County and compare that with a Salt Lake County, there's going to be a big difference in how they do things. But what we want to do is make sure that the same bases are covered, that the important parts of the LNA, what we're testing here is the equipment, making sure that it's correct, doing that. So we're setting the guidelines, kind of the overall principles or guidelines, the boundaries, and then letting them have their own processes within that.
That's interesting. So, one complaint I've heard is that these machines are hooked to the internet and someone gets in and programs them. How do you keep that from happening?
So we literally don't connect them to the internet. So that's one of the easiest myths to dispel. Because anything that tabulate votes is not, nor has it ever been connected to the state of Utah. It doesn't even have that capability. So these rooms, sometimes they are connected with a couple of other computers that can be used for things like adjudication. So somebody makes a mistake on their ballot, there's a couple of people that will review that ballot, but it's a closed network with no outside access at all. It's literally connected one computer to another, not to the outside world.
And so these machines don't have Wi-Fi access inside of them and stuff?
No, they don't.
So that actually, is that part of an audit procedure? How do you make sure that's not happening?
So we do have a software validation component. That's another rule that was given to our office during the legislative session, where we'll do a little bit more with validating the software. So all of the software we use within the state, except for ranked choice voting has an exception, is certified by the Election Assistance Commission, which is a federal group that sets standards and guidelines for elections. So we'll validate that software, and then we'll also have the clerks as part of their canvas reports and the audit reports that they give to their legislative body when the election's done and is being certified. We'll have a component there where they certify that anytime those machines were worked on, there's always somebody with them, and also that they've never been connected to the internet.
Interesting. So do you follow some of these stories that people come up with about how they hacked the election? Or
absolutely, and I've probably read, if there's a story out there or a theory or an idea or something that happened, I've probably
and so that's one of the things that you're doing when you're creating these manuals, is making sure that you have some test for this possible vulnerability in the system.
Absolutely. And if we're going to look at things, throughout my life, I realize that nobody's perfect. Elections aren't perfect. People want this absolutely perfect election. There's always going to be mistakes that are made. I think we do a great job in Utah with elections, but we're not perfect. And if we can see things happening throughout the country and we can learn from other people's mistakes, that's even better than learning from our own mistakes. So, if these things happen or there's vulnerabilities out there, we always try to think through, okay, what could happen? Could that happen in Utah? If so, what would the steps be, or how would we catch that and prevent that from affecting the outcome of an election?
So were you guys involved with the bill that came through my committee then?
Yeah, we were heavily involved. And that bill actually, the origins of that came from the county clerks and the lieutenant governor's office working together after the 2020 election, kind of even before all of the questions started arising. Brian McKenzie and myself sat down from Davis County, and we just went A to Z through all of our elections. We talked about every process that we have, every step, and we tried to identify vulnerabilities, and we came up with a bunch of the things that are in HB 313. And working with the Lieutenant Governor's office even before I was there, they were very supportive. They also had some ideas that they added together, and that kind of became the basis for HB 313. And then there were other things added throughout the legislative process. Some of these other ideas and groups got involved. There were community advocates that were involved, different legislators that were involved. But the origins of that bill really were from the ground up in conjunction with the Lieutenant Governor's office being proactive.
That's really comforting to hear that there is a concern about these elections, and that you're trying to go through and standardize pretty much the way things happen. I guess that the idea that, well, another idea in that movie that came up was the idea that these ballots that they were dropping in the box actually were valid ballots. They would just go out and supposedly pay people to turn over their ballots, right? And I guess one of the things that we have in place is the signature still has to be verified, right?
Yeah, and so there's a lot of different laws around the country. So when we hear all these things, everybody just wants to be like, okay, this is how it happens because this is the way Georgia does it, this is the way Arizona does it, this is the way Nevada does it. Every state has their own. There's some states that don't even require a signature. So in a state like that, there'd be a high value in a party or interested candidate to go out and get those ballots, because basically ballots are the currency through which we purchase democracy.
Right.
And so those have a high value. So if you don't have those safeguards in place, then in that case, it's very valuable. There's some states that require a witness signature. So it doesn't necessarily have to be signed by the voter. It just has to be signed by somebody that watched the voter put it in the envelope. So in that case, that creates a very high value, because I could get a bunch of those envelopes. Now I just need people to sign it saying they saw somebody vote it, and they could put those in. In Utah, that signature has to match the known signature of the voter that we got from the driver's license or from the time when they registered to
And the
vote.
important point there
way
is
to
they
do
actually
it.
had to have a physical ID when they signed up, didn't they?
Correct. It had to be a validated ID.
So I guess that would eliminate a lot of that, right?
It would.
We hear about this idea of ballot harvesting. What do they do there?
So I kind of described a couple of the different schemes, and basically it's trying to get a hold of those ballots and then be able to vote them. And one of the mind shifts that elections officials made when we went to vote by mail, and we need to do a better job of educating it, is it used to be when you walked into the polling place, it was very, very difficult to get a ballot, right? That was the safeguard, is, okay, we're going to number all of the ballots. We're going to have a set number. When somebody comes in, they have to show ID. We're going to give them one ballot. And then we, had secure ballot boxes, but you would just go basically put that in the ballot box. But the ballot was what was hard to get to. With vote by mail, we're sending out hundreds of thousands of ballots throughout a jurisdiction or throughout the state. So there's a lot of ballots out there, and now the security's around the ballot box. And so that's where we're really keying in on.
So one level of security is the fact that you're very judicious in making sure that the voter registration files are correct, right?
Correct.
And so that's an important piece of it. And I could see, when all of a sudden the whole country went to vote by mail, there may have been a lot of states that had poor registration database.
And they absolutely would have. I mean, there's no way when you're transitioning, because we started in Utah, we had the presidential primary the beginning of March, and then COVID basically hit the end of that week. So basically, if you're talking a March timeframe to doing a November election, and you're completely changing the way that you do things, and knowing that there's those issues in the registration database of just people who have moved, that kind of stuff, there's no way that you would have time to get that up to speed or to the standard that we adhere to in Utah.
So the person getting the ballot had to have signed and shown an ID in order to get on that list, right?
Correct.
And then their signature, when they send that ballot back in, has to be validated, right?
Has to match. Yep.
And there's probably something on that envelope that ties back to that person, right?
There's some identifiers. And the other thing too that we have to keep in mind is they are signing an affidavit swearing that they are a legally qualified voter and that is their ballot. So even above all the different layers of security, it's still a crime. And depending on what was done there, it would be either a misdemeanor or a felony. So there's also the component, if you look at banks and all the security that banks have, to stop bank robberies. Do bank robberies occasionally happen? Yes. It's a crime to do that, but they have all of these other security measures in place to try to limit the number of times that could happen, and ballots are no different.
So one form of ballot harvesting, though, is simply knowing who didn't vote and then show up at their doorstep and say, do you need some help voting, right?
Correct.
And that would be fairly hard to stop, right?
It would be, yes.
But I don't think we have any law that says you couldn't send a postcard to all the people that didn't vote already.
No, and candidates subscribe to lists all the time. So the candidates will have a list of who has voted in the election. Voter registration, there's 3 different classifications of privacy, and we won't get into all of that. But candidates can request voter lists of the voters. And so they'll match that up, and they'll be like, okay, who's voted, who hasn't voted, because those are their targets. They want to target those people who haven't voted. So yeah, they're out there contacting, trying to get those people to vote.
But what you've done is provided these lists to any candidate that wants them.
Correct, yes.
And so they can still have get out the vote efforts, right? Because now they know after the 10th day of voting that, all of these people voted, and so they know who's registered, so they know who to target, right?
Exactly, yeah, to try to get out. Phone calls, robocalls are really popular in Utah, mailings, that type of stuff.
And so there's no law against that in Utah.
Yeah, there's no law against contacting voters. There is a law against going to people's houses, asking for their ballot. So it's illegal for you to turn in a ballot that's not for somebody in your immediate household.
Okay. So if I went to households and I just said, here's $10, give me your ballot, I'm breaking the law then, right?
Correct, yes.
And so the voter is supposed to deposit their own. Now, if they live in your household, though, it doesn't say I can't go to my grandmother's house and take her ballot to the ballot box.
Correct.
Right?
You could take your ballot in. A lot of the counties do postage paid. The other thing that we do in Utah that I think is actually a reducer of ballot harvesting, or even that concept, is having drop boxes accessible. So the same bill that put in security cameras also requires a drop box to be located in every municipality and on every Native American reservation. So having access to those where they're close, so it's not a burden to try to return that ballot.
Or they can just put it in the mailbox if they want to.
They can put it in the mailbox and it'll get there.
And I noticed the envelopes have the return address as the county. Is there some reason for that?
Yeah, so if you look, both the addressee and the return address, like you stated, those are both the county clerk. And that's meant so that if it's in the post office and say there isn't sufficient postage, or the post office doesn't read it correctly, either way it's going back to the county clerk, and so that those aren't getting returned back to voters.
Now in Utah, do we have postage paid on those envelopes?
It's county to county. So in a lot of the counties they do pay postage. One of the issues with that is it's very expensive to do that. So if you're in a smaller county with a very low volume, you can pay 10 or 12 cents more per returned envelope than it would cost to put a stamp on it. And so with having those drop boxes accessible, things like that, it really isn't a big burden for people to return those.
Makes that better. But because you have the return address the same as the address, if somebody dropped that in the mailbox and it didn't have a stamp on it, it would come to you to put a stamp on it, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would still come. Most of the counties have an account with the post office, and they have an agreement, so that would just be charged to the county, so they would pay the postage on that.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously we want people to put a stamp on it
if
or
it
do
needs
that,
to.
but it is
Weber,
a fail-safe.
in Weber County that you were over, we actually had a return postage on it, right?
We did not pay postage
did not.
here. Yeah.
Okay, and so, but we have a number of different drop boxes, right?
Yeah, so Weber County has 21 drop boxes, and one of the analysis for one of the gubernatorial campaigns in 2020 actually did an analysis, and Weber County actually has the highest density of drop boxes in the country. And so putting those where they're easily available at communities, places like libraries, city halls, there's one on campus, things like that. It just makes it so there's an easy place to return that, which makes it so you don't have to go door to door.
And then each of those drop boxes now, according to the new law, is going to have a camera on it.
Correct.
To watch it. I was fascinated with the technology in that D'Souza movie where they had just bought people don't realize that in your cell phone, every time it hits a tower, it communicates your location. Of course, it needs to know the location so it knows how to route calls, right? And they had bought these databases, and one of the things that they did was they watched where people were driving, and then they started clustering data and saying, we know every single car that's moving around, really cell phone, right? Now, can we find a record where somebody visits more than one of these drop boxes. And it actually, I think at first they did 10. They said if you visited 10 separate drop boxes in a certain amount of time, then that particular cell phone was targeted, and then they could kind of trace down exactly when they arrived at those drop boxes, and then they'd look at the cameras to identify people that were doing that. That seems like, at some stage maybe we could do that from the election side, right?
Yeah, then that's definitely a possibility.
As a different security measure. The thing is, though, people that are doing this on purpose actually know what's being done to counter them, right?
Yeah, it's like with internet security. So my degree is in information systems, and everything that you try to do internet security wise, you always have to try to be one step ahead, because these things are mutating, they're changing, they're trying different tactics, and both of the major parties are trying to gain an advantage, you know. And so that's one of the things sometimes we hear nationally is, it really kind of becomes a one-sided argument depending on which side of the aisle you're in. Our perspective is everybody's has that opportunity, and so we're trying to decrease that,
decrease the possibility that can actually work.
Exactly.
Right? And I think just the idea that someone had to give an ID in order to receive a voter registration, and they had to sign it so that you have a copy of their signature. And now they have to, that ballot that they get, the ballot itself may not have their ID on it, but there's identifying characteristics on the envelope, right? And so when that envelope comes, who sent it, and you can look up what their signature looks like, right?
Exactly, and it has to be a matching signature. A lot of the signatures that don't match, we find are, kind of household things. There was an article a couple of years ago about missionary moms, for example, and typically most of that stuff happens within a household, but there are checks and balances in place to make sure that those don't get counted.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you do have a missionary, you really have to send the ballot to them and let them sign it, right?
Yeah, and we do have programs for military overseas voters, which if they're out of the country, we have a program where we can work directly with them. One of the things that I would really like to address a little bit is just voter responsibility in this.
That's something I didn't think about, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so we do all of these things, that we've talked about. But at the end of the day, there's also a responsibility of the public to make sure that their voter registration is up to date, that their address is correct. For example, one of the things we hear a lot of times is, I've got a neighbor, or my son got married, my daughter got married, they haven't lived there for years, they keep getting ballots there. And it's like, well, why is that happening? Because nobody's bothered to tell the clerk. They haven't done like the change of address at the post office. When we do these mailings, those could still be going to that house. So it's important, if you see that or hear that, have them contact their county clerk's office. Then they can start the process for removing that voter, making them inactive, and getting that registration up to date.
Or moving that registration somewhere else.
Getting it to the correct place. One thing that we are doing this year that I think is going to be a really big benefit, this was something that was piloted in Weber County last year. Statewide, Representative Dan Johnson, ran a bill last year that would require us to provide some sort of a tracking system for ballots that also gives voters notifications. So if you go to the utah.gov, vote.utah.gov website, or your county clerk's website, there's a program called Ballot Tracks. It's an opt-in, and you can sign up for it, and it'll give you a text message that'll say, hey, your ballot's being mailed. Expect it within a week. When your ballot's returned to the clerk's office, it'll give you either a text or an email notification. If you don't have either of those, it'll even give you a voice call with a recording that just says, hey, your ballot's been received by the clerk's office. If it's not counted for some reason, it will also give you a notification of that. And then ultimately, when your ballot has been counted, it will give you notification of that as well. And so that's a great opportunity for the public to be able to follow their ballot and basically know where it's at any given time. And that's a free service for people to sign up.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so that's something people should look into. I like that you brought up that idea of what the voters' responsibilities are, though, because some people, will complain about something that's happening, but then they'll never contact the clerk to tell them that it's happening, right?
Yeah, when we get a lot of anecdotal kind of conversations, we'll talk to people and they present this issue, and then we'll ask them for specifics. We'll be like, okay, can you give us the name of your neighbor or the address, or tell us who they got ballots for that don't live there. And for whatever reason, people are reluctant to do that, or they can't do that. And it's really important because we'll investigate anything. Like I said, I feel strongly and confident in our process. But if you know of something that happened that's either fraudulent or people like give us the information. We need that information in order to track it down. Otherwise, it's just kind of a hypothetical story, and there's not enough evidence for us to go track it down and figure out what happened. So it's important to give us real information with that.
This has been fascinating. I appreciate you coming. I really like people to understand, I think, that the state of Utah is serious about this, and that there are things being put into place. And I guess the other thing is, back to that voter responsibility, if voters out there see things that they think are a problem in the system, they should probably contact their local legislator and say, hey, we need to change this.
Yep, absolutely. And the biggest thing we're saying to people now, because you can go watch news networks or read stories, all this stuff, our biggest plea to people is go talk to your county clerk, go see how they actually do it. And in those tours that they give, they are a wide open book. They'll take any question and answer that. And it's really important that you have that opportunity to ask them. But really, if you kind of see something, say something. And if there is something we can do better, we're definitely open to doing it.
Yeah, that's very good. Well, we've been talking with Ryan Cowley from the State Elections Office. Congratulations on your new position. We're happy to have you there, and keep up the good work. Is there anything else you'd like to tell people?
Yeah, so ballots will be mailed June 7th, so you can expect your ballot within about a week. Statewide, there are Republican races everywhere. You do have to be a registered Republican in order to vote that. There are areas of the state where there are Democratic races, so if you're a member of another party, unaffiliated Democrats, you're welcome to vote in that. Democrats will be mailed a ballot, others need to request it. And then there's a few areas with school boards, so everybody will get a school board regardless of their party affiliation. And you can go to vote.utah.gov to check your registration status and see what's on your ballot, but those will be coming out really soon here, starting on June 7th. So
very good. Thank you very much, Ryan.
Thank you.
We'll see you next week.